Welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at a real historical moment where confidence at the top collided with terrain, weather, and an enemy decision made far from the front. This isn't a legend or a simplified war story. It's a chain of assumptions, orders, and consequences that reshaped the Korean War in a matter of days. And it begins in November 1950, when the maps in American stabs started to look like the war was already finished. The dangerous part is not how the battle began. The dangerous part is how certain everyone felt before it began. By late November 1950, thousands of men were moving deeper into the mountains of northeastern Korea, believing the campaign was almost over, while another army, moving without radios and mostly at night, was already closing the trap. When the first signals came out of the darkness, it wasn't just gunfire that surprised them. It was the realization that the war they thought they understood had quietly changed shape. By November, the American command believed the Korean War was entering its final phase. 5 months earlier, UN forces had been pushed to the edge of collapse around the Pusan perimeter. Now the operational picture looked reversed. The North Korean People's Army had been battered and broken, and UN formations had surged north beyond the 38th parallel. Seoul had changed hands multiple times, but it was again in UN control. On staff maps, the red arrows no longer pointed toward the sea. They pointed toward the Yalu River. That change in momentum produced a subtle shift in planning culture. From Tokyo headquarters to forward command posts, war planning began to resemble a clean, linear exercise. Resistance was increasingly described as remnants and pockets. The staff language moved from uncertainty to scheduling. Not whether the campaign would end, but how soon. Operational orders emphasized speed, initiative, and continuous advance. The war, as a problem to be solved, seemed to be running out of time. This was the psychological environment in which the phrase, "home by Christmas," gained traction. It wasn't an official motto, but it traveled quickly because it matched what many wanted to believe. It also shaped behavior. Soldiers packed and marched as if the next weeks were a final push, not the opening of a new phase. Risk felt acceptable because victory felt inevitable. In that atmosphere, caution could look like hesitation. At the top, General Douglas MacArthur publicly minimized the likelihood of large-scale Chinese intervention. The Yalu River was recognized as a political boundary, but not treated as a looming battlefield. Intelligence reporting, sightings, prisoner statements, scattered warnings suggested Chinese forces were concentrating north of the border, but such fragments were often interpreted as defensive posturing or exaggerated rumor. The absence of a clear, unified picture became an excuse to hold on to the preferred one. Within this framework, UN forces continued advancing into northern and northeastern Korea. One axis moved toward the Chosin Reservoir. On paper, it did not appear to be the main effort. It did not lead directly to Pyongyang, and it carried little symbolic weight compared to the capital. But operational logic and political momentum pushed forces forward anyway. Secure the approaches, control the high ground, deny the enemy space to regroup, and press toward the frontier. Geography, however, imposed a different kind of logic, one that did not care about optimism. The Chosin Reservoir sat in steep, mountainous country, where roads were scarce and movement was channelized. A column could not spread out across open ground. It had to follow narrow routes cut into slopes and passes. A single blocked bridge or ambushed curve could halt an entire formation. Off-road maneuver for heavy vehicles was close to impossible. This meant that the front line wasn't a line at all. It was a string of separated positions connected by one lifeline of road. Logistics in that terrain became a constant constraint. Villages were few and small. Local resources could not support large units. Supplies had to travel long distances over vulnerable routes. Fuel was not just fuel. It was heat, mobility, and the ability to keep engines alive overnight. Winter clothing was not a comfort item. It was survival equipment. Any shortage that might have been inconvenient elsewhere became decisive in the mountains. Climate turned those constraints into pressure. Late November in northeastern Korea meant deep winter arriving early. Night temperatures could fall toward -30 degrees Celsius, with wind turning cold into something that felt physically aggressive. Metal exposed skin like a burn. Oil thickened in mechanisms. Rubber stiffened and cracked. Soldiers learned quickly that stopping could be more dangerous than moving, because immobility invited frostbite and exhaustion. American units were also spread thin. Elements of the 1st Marine Division and U.S. Army formations occupied positions separated by distance and terrain, sometimes dozens of kilometers apart. In such conditions, coordination relied heavily on communications that were already strained. Cold drained radio batteries faster than expected. Terrain disrupted signals. Wire lines were difficult to maintain. Isolation grew not as a dramatic event, but as a gradual condition, one that might not be fully recognized until the moment it mattered. Yet the advance continued because the immediate contacts seemed to confirm the narrative. Patrols met small enemy groups that withdrew quickly. Those encounters reinforced the assumption that the enemy was collapsing. The campaign was treated as a closing act. The human mind, once committed to a conclusion, tends to interpret new information in a way that supports it. But beyond the Yalu, a different decision had already been made. The People's Republic of China chose to intervene, while avoiding the political label of open war. Forces entered Korea under the name People's Volunteer Army, a term designed to create diplomatic ambiguity, not to describe the reality on the ground. These were organized, experienced formations, with commanders shaped by years of civil conflict and accustomed to mass movement, harsh conditions, and night operations. Chinese units crossed quietly, moving primarily at night, avoiding roads and minimizing communications. In the mountains, entire columns could vanish by day and appear by night. American intelligence received fragments, sightings, rumors, reports, but the scale and intent remained unclear until it was too late to be a warning. By late November, Chinese forces had positioned themselves around UN units near Chosin, studying routes and ridgelines, preparing not for a simple fight, but for isolation and encirclement. American soldiers wrote home about cold and fatigue, not fear. Most still believed they were nearing the finish line. Few imagined that this isolated, frozen terrain would become the place where the war's character changed. That illusion would not fade gradually. It would break abruptly on the night of November 26th to 27th, when the darkness began to carry signals that didn't belong to the wind. Tell us what city you're from in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It's the best support, and we'll keep moving forward. By the evening of November 25, 1950, American forces around the Chosin Reservoir occupied a position that was operationally fragile, though this was not yet fully understood at every level of command. Units of the 1st Marine Division, along with attached Army elements, were distributed along a single mountain road that functioned as both supply line and escape route. The terrain forced this linear deployment. There were no alternative routes, no depth, and no room for maneuver. What appeared on maps as orderly spacing translated on the ground into isolation. As daylight faded, environmental conditions deteriorated rapidly. Around 1800, temperatures began to fall sharply, faster than forecasts had predicted. By 2100, thermometers showed below -25 degrees Celsius, and the cold continued to deepen. Radio batteries drained at an accelerated rate, often failing without warning. Weapon lubricants thickened, slowing moving parts. Men discovered that basic mechanical functions could no longer be taken for granted. The cold was no longer a background condition. It had become a factor shaping every action. While American units adjusted to the weather, Chinese forces completed their final preparations. The Chinese 9th Army Group, had moved into position without alerting UN command to the scale of its presence. Orders were issued for a coordinated night attack. Radio silence was absolute. Communication relied on whistles, horns, and simple signals agreed upon in advance. The intent was not to engage in sustained frontal battles, but to strike suddenly, disrupt cohesion, and isolate individual units before they could react. The first attacks began shortly before midnight on November 26th, around 23:45. Outposts near Udam-ni and Hagaru-ri reported contact almost simultaneously. There was no preparatory bombardment, no warning flare or artillery fire. Instead, American soldiers heard unfamiliar sounds emerging from the darkness, horn blasts and shouted commands echoing across frozen slopes. Moments later, silhouettes appeared, moving quickly downhill toward the perimeter. Chinese infantry advanced in dense formations, closing distance before opening fire. Many attacks began without gunfire, allowing assaulting troops to approach within close range. When shooting started, it did so at distances that neutralized American advantages in firepower and support weapons. The result was immediate confusion. Engagements fragmented into dozens of isolated fights, fought in darkness, broken terrain, and extreme cold. By 1 o'clock on November 27th, it was clear that the attacks were not limited probes. Pressure was applied along the entire perimeter. Communications between positions deteriorated further, and in some cases ceased entirely. Company and battalion commanders were forced to make decisions independently, often without knowing the status of adjacent units. The battlefield no longer resembled a front. It became a collection of disconnected strongpoints under simultaneous assault. Major General Oliver P. Smith received the first coherent reports around 2 o'clock. The pattern of attacks, their coordination, and their persistence made one conclusion unavoidable. This was not the remains of the North Korean army. These were fresh, organized formations, operating according to a deliberate plan. Smith ordered units to hold their ground, maintain defensive perimeters, and prepare for sustained combat. By dawn, however, it was evident that the concept of a continuous defensive line no longer applied. Morning brought no relief. Temperatures dropped further, reaching approximately -30 degrees Celsius. Weapons malfunctioned with increasing frequency. Bolts froze in place. Springs lost tension. Soldiers kept rifles under parkas to preserve warmth, removing them only when contact was imminent. Reloading with bare hands caused immediate frostbite. Even minor injuries became life-threatening, as blood loss and cold combined to overwhelm the body. Medical evacuation proved extremely difficult. Roads were under observation and fire. Vehicles struggled to operate on icy surfaces and in thin mountain air. In some cases, evacuation was simply impossible. Medics focused on keeping wounded men conscious and alive until conditions allowed movement. The danger of sleep became widely understood. Exhaustion could be fatal if it led to unconsciousness in the cold. By early afternoon on November 27th, reports confirmed that Chinese forces had seized the high ground overlooking the road south. This effectively sealed the encirclement. American units were no longer merely under attack, they were cut off. Supply, reinforcement, and withdrawal all depended on regaining control of that single route. It was at this moment that General Smith made the decision that would shape the entire operation. He rejected the language of retreat. His order emphasized movement to the south in an organized manner through combat with all units accounted for. This framing was deliberate. It preserved discipline and prevented panic. Commanders were not instructed to flee. They were instructed to fight their way out while maintaining structure. On November 28th, organized movement through the encirclement began. Columns advanced along the road under continuous fire from surrounding heights. Progress was slow and costly. Each ridgeline had to be cleared or suppressed. In many cases, units attacked laterally or even backward to relieve pressure on trapped elements. Air support provided essential supplies and evacuation, but it could not alter the fundamental reality of terrain and cold. By the end of November, one conclusion was unavoidable. American forces had not been destroyed. They remained cohesive, commanded, and capable of resistance. But the assumptions that had brought them to Chosin, the belief in a collapsing enemy and an imminent end to the war, had been irreversibly shattered. By December 1, 1950, the fighting around the Chosin Reservoir had entered a fundamentally different phase. The original operational goals no longer applied. There was no longer any attempt to seize or hold ground in the north. The overriding priority became survival through controlled, deliberate movement to the south. Every decision was now judged by a single measure: whether it preserved the force as an organized, functioning formation. Responsibility for directing this breakout rested with Major General Oliver P. Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division. His approach contrasted sharply with the optimism that had characterized higher-level planning earlier in the campaign. Before the Chinese intervention, Smith had insisted on slower movement, the establishment of supply points, and defensible intermediate positions. At the time, these measures were seen by some as excessive caution. In practice, they became the structural framework that made withdrawal possible. At lower levels of command, the burden of execution fell on regimental and battalion leaders. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Marines, played a central role during this phase. His units were repeatedly tasked with holding the most exposed sectors of the route south. Puller's priorities were consistent and uncompromising: maintain contact between units, prevent fragmentation, and ensure that wounded personnel were not left behind. The road was not simply a route of movement. It was the axis on which the entire force depended. Smith was explicit in rejecting any form of unstructured retreat. Movement was to be conducted only in organized columns with designated advance, main body, and rear guard elements. Flanks were to be secured wherever terrain allowed. No unit was permitted to break away independently. This insistence on order had a stabilizing effect, particularly under conditions where isolation and exhaustion could easily have led to collapse. Several technical and organizational factors combined to make the breakout possible. The first was the preservation of command cohesion. Even when radio contact was lost, subordinate commanders understood the intent of the operation and acted accordingly. The shared understanding of objectives prevented contradictory actions and reduced the risk of panic-driven decisions. In an environment where information was incomplete, clarity of intent proved more valuable than constant communication. Air support was the second decisive factor. Aircraft operated almost continuously, despite weather and terrain limitations. They suppressed enemy positions overlooking the road, delivered ammunition and food, and evacuated wounded personnel. Just as importantly, they transported engineering supplies. Chinese forces repeatedly damaged sections of the road and destroyed bridges. Without rapid repair, movement would have halted entirely. Engineers worked under fire and in extreme cold, rebuilding critical infrastructure while the column waited behind them. One of the most difficult tasks involved restoring damaged bridges. In at least one instance, engineers were forced to reconstruct a crossing almost from the ground up, using materials delivered by air. This work was conducted under constant threat, with limited tools and in sub-zero temperatures. The successful passage of artillery and vehicles across these repaired spans often determined whether the column could continue moving at all. Discipline within the columns was another essential element. Movement was slow and deliberate. Advance elements cleared or suppressed high ground. The main body followed in tightly controlled intervals. Rear guard units fought repeatedly to prevent Chinese forces from closing in behind the column. These rear actions were often intense and costly, but they bought time. Artillery played a critical role, and guns were not abandoned despite the difficulty of moving them. Their firepower was essential for holding key terrain long enough for the rest of the force to pass. At the lowest levels, individual leadership often determined outcomes. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers gathered scattered soldiers, reorganized depleted units, and established hasty defensive positions on exposed ridgelines. Decisions were made quickly, often without guidance from higher command. Medics worked under constant pressure, aware that evacuation might be delayed for hours. In many cases, their immediate task was not transport, but keeping wounded men alive and conscious through the night. Cold continued to inflict heavy losses. Frostbite incapacitated thousands of soldiers. Fingers, toes, and in some cases, eyesight were permanently damaged. These injuries accumulated silently, without the visible drama of combat. Yet discipline did not collapse. Order was maintained because leadership remained visible and active at every level. Soldiers continued to move because their units continued to function. By December 7th to 10th, the majority of American forces had cleared the mountainous region around the reservoir. Chinese pressure began to ease as terrain opened and supply lines shortened. Evacuation and resupply became more reliable. The final phase of the operation centered on the port of Hungnam, where the withdrawal from northern Korea would be completed. The evacuation at Hungnam expanded beyond a purely military operation. Alongside troops and equipment, tens of thousands of Korean civilians were transported south. What had begun as a tactical extraction evolved into a large-scale humanitarian evacuation. American forces departed northern Korea with most of their personnel, artillery, and vehicles intact, an outcome that had seemed unlikely only days earlier. The operation at Chosin was not a victory in the conventional sense. Chinese intervention succeeded in halting the UN advance and forcing a withdrawal. However, the destruction of the encircled force did not occur. That result was shaped by leadership decisions, technical capabilities, and sustained human endurance under extreme conditions. After Chosin, expectations changed permanently. The Korean War moved forward not as a campaign of rapid advances, but as a test of endurance, organization, and limits. By early December 1950, it was no longer possible to treat the environment around the Chosin Reservoir as a passive backdrop to combat. Cold had become an active force, shaping every aspect of the battle. It influenced movement, decision-making, casualty rates, and the limits of human endurance. Commanders and soldiers alike came to understand that survival depended as much on adaptation to the climate as on responses to enemy action. At sustained temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius, modern military systems began to fail in ways that planning assumptions had not fully accounted for. Standard lubricants froze or thickened, rendering moving parts sluggish or immobile. Metals became brittle, increasing the likelihood of mechanical failure. Engines that were shut down for even short periods often could not be restarted. Vehicles had to be kept running continuously, consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate. Rubber components cracked, seals failed, and electrical systems became unreliable. Weapons were particularly vulnerable. Firearms designed for temperate European conditions did not function predictably in extreme cold. Soldiers were forced to strip weapons of normal lubrication, increasing friction and wear, but reducing the risk of total seizure. Even then, malfunctions were frequent. Clearing a jam with bare hands risked immediate frostbite. In many cases, a single mechanical failure at the wrong moment proved fatal. For the individual soldier, the cold imposed a constant physical burden. Exposure numbed hands and feet within minutes. Sensation faded, followed by pain, and then by permanent damage. Tasks that required fine motor control, loading magazines, adjusting sights, tying bandages, became increasingly difficult. Many soldiers learned to operate weapons and equipment by touch rather than sight, often under stress and in darkness. Mistakes were common, and consequences were immediate. Medical care was transformed by the environment. Blood loss accelerated the onset of hypothermia, reducing the body's ability to clot and recover, Wounds that would normally have been survivable became fatal when combined with cold exposure. Morphine syrettes froze, making pain management unreliable. Plasma and other fluids thickened or congealed. Stretchers left on snow became rigid with ice. Delays in evacuation, even of a few hours, frequently determined whether a wounded man lived or died. The cold also altered tactical behavior at the small unit level. Defensive positions could not be held indefinitely, regardless of enemy pressure. Soldiers who remained stationary for too long risked freezing. Units rotated positions not because of incoming fire, but to maintain circulation and warmth. Sleep became a calculated risk. Falling asleep while exposed could result in death. Informal systems developed to keep men awake during night watches, with soldiers checking one another for signs of hypothermia and exhaustion. Chinese forces suffered extensively from the same conditions. In many cases, their losses to cold exceeded those caused by combat. Winter clothing was often inadequate, particularly footwear. Medical support was limited, and evacuation capabilities were minimal. Entire units were reduced in strength by frostbite alone. After engagements, bodies were discovered frozen in place, weapons still held, indicating the severity and suddenness of exposure-related death. Despite these losses, the cold aligned in certain ways with Chinese operational doctrine. Their reliance on light infantry reduced dependence on vehicles and heavy equipment that struggled in low temperatures. Night movement minimized exposure to daytime wind and observation. Close-range attacks shortened engagements and reduced the need for prolonged static positions. Chinese soldiers were accustomed to hardship and operated within a command culture that accepted extreme losses as a cost of success. American forces were forced to adapt rapidly. Weapons maintenance procedures were revised in the field. Engines were kept running despite fuel shortages, prioritizing functionality over conservation. Soldiers slept in shifts, fully clothed, whenever conditions allowed. Commanders learned that logistical planning was inseparable from survival. Fuel, food, and shelter were not secondary considerations, but operational necessities. Every movement was evaluated through the lens of environmental cost. At higher levels of command, the cold reshaped decision-making. Timelines became flexible out of necessity. Objectives were reassessed not solely based on enemy resistance, but on what men and machines could physically endure. Speed gave way to precision. Operations slowed, not due to hesitation, but because environmental limits could not be ignored. Planning became an exercise in balancing risk against the capacity of the force to continue functioning. At Chosin, the cold did not favor one side exclusively. It punished both. However, its effects were uneven. Units that adapted procedures, adjusted expectations, and recognized the environment as a primary threat survived longer and retained effectiveness. Those that treated cold as a secondary concern suffered disproportionately. Survival became a measure of adaptation rather than strength alone. By the time American forces reached lower elevations south of the reservoir, casualties from frostbite rivaled those caused by combat. Thousands were evacuated with permanent injuries, including amputations and lasting nerve damage. The legacy of the battle extended beyond immediate losses. It included long-term disability and psychological strain that followed survivors for decades. The experience at Chosin permanently altered U.S. Army and Marine Corps doctrine regarding cold weather operations. Training programs were revised to emphasize environmental adaptation. Equipment procurement prioritized reliability in extreme conditions. Chosin became a case study taught not as a victory or a defeat, but as a lesson in environmental warfare. The battle demonstrated that technology and numbers offered little advantage if the environment itself was misunderstood or underestimated. The outcome at the Chosin Reservoir reshaped the Korean War at every level of command and perception. What had begun as an ambitious offensive aimed at rapid unification collapsed into a strategic recalibration imposed by reality. The campaign's momentum was broken not by a single defeat, but by the cumulative effect of unexpected resistance, environmental limits, and a misjudgment of the enemy's intentions and capabilities. Chinese intervention achieved its immediate operational objective. United Nations forces were halted and forced to withdraw southward. The advance toward the Yalu River ended permanently. What had been treated as a temporary political boundary now reasserted itself as a firm military line. From that point forward, any assumption that the war could be decisively concluded through continued northward movement was no longer credible. At the same time, Chinese leadership drew sobering conclusions from the battle. The expectation that UN forces could be destroyed through encirclement proved incorrect. Despite surprise, isolation, and extreme conditions, American units retained cohesion and command integrity. Their ability to withdraw in an organized manner under constant pressure forced Beijing to reassess assumptions about U.S. military fragility and the effectiveness of attritional tactics alone. For the United States, Chosin ended the illusion that the war would be limited in scope or duration. The conflict could no longer be framed as a police action or a short, punitive campaign. It was now understood as a full-scale war against a disciplined opponent capable of sustaining heavy losses. This realization reshaped both military planning and political expectations in Washington. Operational priorities shifted accordingly. Large-scale offensive maneuvers gave way to defensive consolidation. Supply lines were shortened to reduce vulnerability. Positions were selected based on terrain that could be held and sustained, rather than rapidly seized. Winter warfare planning, previously treated as a contingency, became a central consideration in all future operations on the peninsula. At the strategic level, tensions between civilian leadership and military command intensified. General Douglas MacArthur continued to advocate escalation, including expanded operations against Chinese territory. The Truman administration, influenced by the evidence emerging from Chosin, moved in the opposite direction. The risks of widening the conflict, particularly in the context of global Cold War tensions, were now seen as unacceptable. This divergence would culminate months later in MacArthur's dismissal. While Chosin was not the sole cause, it provided concrete proof that assumptions about escalation control and enemy restraint were deeply flawed. The battle demonstrated that decisions made at the highest levels carried consequences that could not be reversed by optimism or authority alone. Internationally, the battle altered perceptions of American power. United Nations forces had not been defeated outright, but they had not imposed a decisive outcome either. The image of unstoppable momentum was replaced by one of contested endurance. Allies and adversaries alike adjusted their expectations, recognizing that the war would likely end through negotiation rather than battlefield decision. For soldiers who survived Chosin, the war took on a different meaning. Confidence rooted in inevitability gave way to realism. Survival depended on preparation, leadership, and mutual reliance rather than assumptions of superiority. Casual language about imminent victory disappeared from camps and correspondence. Experience replaced expectation. Within military culture, Chosin became a symbol of endurance rather than triumph. Among U.S. Marines in particular, it entered institutional memory as a defining ordeal. It was not celebrated because it was won, but because the force endured without disintegration. The emphasis shifted from victory narratives to lessons in discipline, cohesion, and resilience under extreme pressure. After Chosin, the strategic balance of the war stabilized. Front lines hardened and movement slowed. Large-scale maneuver gave way to positional fighting, limited advances, and attrition. Negotiations would eventually replace offensives as the primary path toward resolution. The war had revealed its true character, not a race to victory, but a prolonged contest shaped by limits, endurance, and restraint. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir did not determine the outcome of the Korean War, but it revealed its underlying character with unusual clarity. In a matter of weeks, the conflict shed its early assumptions and exposed the limits of planning, power, and prediction. What emerged was not a decisive victory or defeat, but a deeper understanding of what the war was and what it would demand from those who fought it. One of the clearest lessons was the danger of strategic overconfidence. Decisions made far from the battlefield were shaped by expectations rather than conditions. Terrain was reduced to lines on maps. Climate was treated as an inconvenience rather than a decisive factor. The enemy's capacity to adapt was underestimated. Intelligence existed, but it was filtered through assumptions that favored optimistic conclusions. When reality diverged from those assumptions, the cost was immediate and severe. Chosin also demonstrated the limits of technological superiority. Air power, artillery, and mechanized forces provided critical advantages, but they could not compensate for environmental extremes or replace the need for disciplined ground movement. Firepower mattered only when it could be brought to bear, supplied, and sustained. Machines failed when conditions exceeded their design limits. Technology proved powerful, but not decisive in isolation. Leadership under pressure emerged as another defining factor. In environments where collapse was a constant risk, the nature of command mattered more than formal authority. Orders that preserved structure and clarity proved more valuable than those aimed at symbolic objectives. The deliberate refusal to label the withdrawal as a retreat was not rhetorical flourish. It was a practical measure that maintained cohesion. Language itself became a tool of command, capable of stabilizing or undermining units under stress. At the operational level, Chosin underscored the importance of logistical realism. Supply was not a background function, but a central determinant of what could be attempted. Fuel, food, ammunition, and medical support dictated tempo and possibility. The battle revealed that logistics did not merely support operations, they defined them. Plans that ignored this reality collapsed quickly under pressure. Equally important was the role of individual endurance. At Chosin, systems functioned because individuals refused to fail quietly. Officers held positions they could not fully see or control. Non-commissioned officers improvised solutions when formal structures broke down. Medics continued working despite exhaustion and exposure, often with minimal resources. Engineers rebuilt roads and bridges, knowing that delay could mean isolation and death. Survival depended not on heroism, but on sustained effort under conditions that offered no relief. The battle also reshaped how the Korean War was understood historically. It ended the notion that the conflict was peripheral or secondary. Chosin confirmed that Korea was a central theater in the emerging Cold War, not a sideshow. The scale of commitment, the willingness of adversaries to absorb losses, and the strategic consequences of miscalculation all pointed to a conflict with global implications. After Chosin, the war entered a prolonged and grinding phase. It would continue for more than 2 years, marked by positional fighting, limited offensives, and attrition. The conflict would end not with a decisive victory, but with an armistice. Borders would shift only marginally. Losses would remain high. The expectation of a clear and satisfying conclusion disappeared, replaced by acceptance of an imperfect resolution. Within military institutions, Chosin became a reference point rather than a triumph. It was studied not for what was achieved, but for what was endured. Training, doctrine, and planning incorporated its lessons, particularly regarding cold weather operations, command under stress, and the integration of logistics into operational design. The battle's influence extended well beyond Korea, shaping how future conflicts were approached. For those who fought there, the experience left a lasting imprint. The battle stripped away illusions and replaced them with hard-earned realism. It demonstrated that survival in war depends as much on preparation and adaptability as on strength. Confidence rooted in inevitability gave way to respect for uncertainty and limits. In the frozen mountains of northeastern Korea, the war revealed its true demands. It required endurance without guarantees, adaptation without comfort, and decisions whose consequences could not be undone. Chosin did not decide the war, but it defined it, and in doing so, it showed what modern conflict would require from those sent to fight it. This was the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, not as a legend, but as it unfolded in reality, through decisions, conditions, and consequences that reshaped the war. It marked the end of illusions and the beginning of a conflict defined by endurance rather than momentum. Thank you for watching and for staying with this story to the end. Subscribe to the channel to support our work, and we'll see you in the next episode.